We have Susan George, who everyone will know the name of. I certainly read her book sometime in the late 1970s, I think, and got into this this field inspired by that classic book. She's the chairperson of TNI, one of the hosts today.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be here, and I really congratulate everyone, including my own institute. I had absolutely nothing to do with the beautiful organization that the ISS and TNI and the other sponsors have provided. So thank you for being so many of you. I'm sorry? You can't hear? Well, it's already been mentioned that a couple of people were forced to read what I wrote in the late 70s. And since I do come here rather as the oldest living inhabitant, perhaps it's useful to, because I'm not working seriously the way all of you are now on these same issues. There's two sorts of scholars, and I think they're both just as good as the other, both categories, but there's some people who plow, so to speak, the same furrows, their lifelong work, and there's others who follow their noses, and that's what happened to me. I followed my nose, and I followed other people's noses, because at one point, our comrades in the South said that debt is the big new contributing factor to hunger, and you've got to work on it. And I said, I can't. I'm not an economist. I don't know anything about that sort of aspect about money. No, you have to work on it. So then I shifted. And then from there, I saw what structural adjustment was. And then from there, I saw how they did it ecologically, how the big corporations, how the think tanks did all of that. So I started working on that line, and so now, one thing does lead to another. But what I wanted to try to do in a very short time is to, perhaps in a telegraphic style, say what we were preoccupied with in the past decades and what seems to be the debate now. And I may be wrong, and this is really just a basis for discussion. But first I'd like to make 2 points which are unfortunately unchanging. The first is not recognized by so many people. You will understand this instantly, all of you. But if you don't have land, as Elizabeth has very rightly pointed out, if you don't have land or the means of access to land in one way or another to produce food, and if you don't have money to buy it, you're going to go hungry. It's as simple as that. This is obvious, but most people do not think along those lines. The other unfortunate truth, and this I'm very sad to say, and I do repeat it, but I always preface it by saying, I am sorry to say that there is no level of human suffering which in and of itself will cause policy to change. I'm sorry, but I have found this again and again. It's not because people are going hungry, starving, their children are undernourished, etc., that the policy is going to change. That only changes when you change the rapport de force, when you change the balance of power. And that is why I think most of you are either helping activists to act, or you are yourselves scholar activists, as we try to be at TNI. Now, Elizabeth said, we peasants are going to feed the world. I think the peasantry is the only body, only collectivity that can say, we are going to feed the world, because that is the truth. And when I hear agribusiness people or governments, technologists say, we're going to feed the world with this, whatever it is, this new technology or whatever. I am like Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's con man. When I hear the word culture, he said, I take out my revolver. And when I hear those people say, we're going to feed the world, I take out my revolver, because this is so untrue. And just on a very sociological gender note, I'd like to say it's wonderful to see so many women, because we weren't that numerous 30, 40 years ago. Well, in 30, 40 years ago, the concept of food sovereignty didn't exist. We were beginning to talk about the right to food. We were looking at notions of farmer control, at food crops versus cash crops. But now we have a much richer concept, thanks to the peasant movements. And we have one that shows how limited the FAO food security definition really is, whereas to a lot of us that seemed to be sufficient quite a while ago. Then, and I'll do the then and now dichotomy, then even though the Stockholm Conference had taken place in 1972 and pointed to the climate changes that were in the future, not many people in the food movement took that very seriously. We didn't integrate the notions of climate change then. Whereas now, I don't think there's a single area of production or distribution or consumption that can be looked at without integrating climate change and global warming in one way or another. And I think we can all agree that global warming and climate change, with their practical consequences, are going to become increasingly important, especially in the lives of poorer farmers who have very little protection and even fewer alternatives. Then, in the 60s and 70s, we were very preoccupied with something called the Green Revolution, which I'm sure you've studied, but probably more historically than we had to do then, because the Green Revolution was an American invention. I'm sure you all know the history of it, but it was driven, of course, by industrial interests, and it was based on not GMOs yet, but another technological invention that was going to feed the world, which is to say high-yielding varieties, lab-developed varieties. And they were going to feed the world, and what they actually did after 30 or 40 years was to make the soil much more saline, to exhaust the aquifers, to poison the soils with chemicals, and to particularly eliminate a great many small farmers, sharecroppers, and landless laborers who were putting in their labor power, but who were not useful when tractors were massively introduced. So there was ecological damage, social damage, and damage to the vast countrysides of a great many countries. But today there isn't even any third world. It was third in relation to the US and in relation to the Soviet Union and its satellites. And everything else was third, 1, 2, 3. And now there are considerable middle classes in countries like India and China. That wasn't possible in those days when there was usually a very small, very rich elite, and then everybody else, or practically, at least in many countries, were working in agriculture. Now that has completely changed. That whole perspective has changed. And other technical fixes have come into play, and many rural people are worse off than they were during the Cold War. But the US had to have something like the Green Revolution so there would be more food, because they were very worried about countries like India joining the communist side. So there was a political implication also for that. At that time, famines and acute food shortages were pretty much localized, and paradoxically, for many people, they took place in the countryside. Now, because of a whole combination of new factors, famines and acute food shortages occur largely because of the volatility of prices. And as you will remember, in 2008, there were 30-some food riots in places as different as Bangladesh and Bolivia. It was all over the world. It wasn't localized, and it was because of food prices, because there wasn't enough food sovereignty to make sure that people would have a reasonable price. So the famine localities changed from the rural areas to the peripheries of large cities, where so many former peasants were then living. And of course, George Bush blamed the middle classes of China and India for this. Absolutely false, like many things that George Bush said. But they had no role. If you look at the statistics, the imports of China and India were no greater in 2008 than they were years before, years after. But as hunger worsened, we were reminded of all the structural adjustment policies of the World Bank and the IMF imposed by debt. And those structural adjustment policies included a very strong message, not to say an order, to produce cash crops rather than food crops, because nobody wanted your shillings or your pesos or your rupees. They wanted hard cash, and the way you got that was through selling cash crops in most countries. And the brilliant economic minds at the bank and the fund had not noted that since everyone was getting exactly the same advice and that there were many countries under structural adjustment, it was likely that exporting not a very broad range of products, the prices would go down. This did not occur to them, apparently. But that is, of course, what happened. And I'm not an economist, but even I can master, oversupply means lower prices. Now we're back there, except it's called austerity this time. And 20% of the children in the UK and in the US are said to be malnourished. That's not very brilliant for a very rich country. And we have Greek pensioners who are rummaging through the rubbish by the 15th of the month because they don't have enough money to buy food by the middle of the month. So we're not doing very well in the rich countries either, and the reasons are the same. You can call it structural adjustment or austerity, but it's the same thing. How close is the bell, Ian?
You've got about 2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay. Well, I wanted to say also that the state used to be much more involved in agriculture, but then privatization took over, and they were not allowed to have the state involved, so the peasant was once more at the mercy of market forces and of usurers. I wanted to say that capital was moving out of food or feed production and moving into the much more profitable areas of supplying inputs or working on post-harvest technology or storage or processing, but land was seen to be risky. And now it's interesting to see that land grabs are going on, and that although the Chinese may be sending battalions of peasant laborers to certain African countries, even so, capital is very interested in having land once more, which was not the case a few years ago. And finally, I'll just note that obesity used to be relatively limited. Now it is quite widespread because of the junk food that is moving all over the world, even in the southern countries. I think partly that's because husbands want to prove that they can afford to stuff their wives, but I'll leave that to the anthropologists here. I don't know whether that's true or not. And finally, the changes of the laws in the South have, in the United States, not in the South, but the changes moving towards a greater degree of neoliberalism have meant that the commodities markets have been utterly changed. They wiped out the laws that protected the food system and the boards of trade for decades, since 1860 approximately. It used to be markets between farmers, futures markets between farmers and purchasers, cookie manufacturers, if you like. And now, and you had to register, you had to say what position you had, so you couldn't corner the market. Now, you can make unlimited trades anonymously, and nobody knows who has how much, and nobody knows who is holding how much. And just to give you a mathematical comparison, in 2003, there were $13 billion riding on commodities futures. In 2008, when the subprime market had collapsed and money was flowing in from people who didn't want to lose on the subprimes, there was 20 times that much, 260 billion. Now that changed the lives of many people thousands of miles away. By raising prices, in one day the price of wheat on those markets went up by 31%. So I still have a minute? No, I don't have anything. I don't have any time. I was going to say one or two things about the future, but we'll leave that for the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Susan.